most impactful parts of a watch is the dial. Not only does it have to serve a purpose with the form, it also has to look beautiful. This is how we can actually tell the time, and it also sets the tone for the style of the watch. There's a few basic elements that have to be included on a watch dial, but other than that, it's really up to the creativity of the watchmaker or the designer. It's the first thing you see when you look at a watch, and when you're interacting with your watch, you're focusing on that dial, or the face, as some call it. The dial is what turns the movement and the mechanism into a device that we can actually read the time by breaking it up into sections. Typically, you'll have 12 hours on the dial and 60 minutes, and you may have 60 seconds as well. There's all sorts of other displays that could be added to a watch. Things like sub-registers for the seconds, or for timing functions like a chronograph. Could also be date mechanisms. There could be moon phases. There could be all sorts of other types of information that can be displayed through the dial of a watch. And all of the different techniques for creating a watch dial are special to a particular watch. There's not really one way to create a watch dial. There are many different ways. A watch that appears to have a blue dial could be painted blue, or it could be galvanized blue. These are two very different processes. They might appear to look the same, but they're achieved in a very different way. Most watch dials start off as a piece of brass. They're made of metal, and they'll have two little feet or pins that stick down from the backside. That allows us to locate them on the movement and fix the dial in place. There are other methods used by certain watchmakers that may use screws, or might even use different types of snapping rings to fix the dial to the movement. But the goal here is always to make sure that the dial is fixed to the movement and cannot rotate. So from that base metal dial, we then have to determine how we're going to decorate it. There's certain things that we think about, like displaying 12 hours. But simply displaying 12 hours could mean a number of dots on the dial, or it could mean all the numerals written out. It might just mean lines to section off the dial. There are all sorts of different ways to display that. To get the background color of the dial, there are two typical ways to achieve that. The first way is to plate that dial. So the brass dial will be plated with possibly a nickel plating, and then that plating would be galvanized. The benefit to this is that you're actually depositing metal on top of metal. This makes for a very durable finish, something that could be even washed with water. Using different types of metal and different thicknesses, different plating methods, you can actually galvanize different colors onto that dial. And these are all metal-based coatings. Things like blues and blacks and silvers, these can all be applied with a process of galvanic coating. Another common way to decorate the background color of a dial is with paints. These paints can be sprayed on and are also quite durable. Not all paints are as durable when it comes to water, but they're durable enough to be inside of a watertight watch case. And a benefit to using paint is that literally any color that you could dream up can be made. When choosing a galvanic coating to achieve a certain color on a dial, you also need to think about the surface finish of that dial. An interesting thing about this way of coloring a dial is that the surface texture that you have on the dial before the galvanic coating can actually be seen through that coating. So if you do a sunburst pattern on the metal, you will see that through the coating. A thicker coating of paint will actually hide the metal finish beneath it. So it's not as essential to have a flawless or uniform finish on the dial before painting, if the paint is thick. There are many dials that utilize a thick oil paint, and this paint actually appears as though it is bead blasted prior to painting. It isn't the case. The dial is actually smooth, and the paint itself has the texture in it. But on a galvanically treated dial, you would need to bead blast and then do the galvanic coating in order to achieve this same look. So depending on the type of coating you choose, you then have to think about what the surface finish needs to be, the desired look. For a glossy dial, that could mean polishing the metal prior to treating it with a galvanic process. Or it could mean galvanizing that dial and then applying a varnish or a lacquer. For a paint, it would mean painting and then applying some sort of high gloss varnish or lacquer. So there's an unlimited number of finishes and colors and ways to achieve it as far as the dial of the watch goes. And that's just the background color. Then we get into fonts and logos, numerals, indices. Indices are simply markers. They could mark, for instance, the hours, and they could be rectangles, they could be circular, or they could be applied. They might be ink or a metal applied indice, in which case we need a way to locate them in the proper position. So a metal applied indice usually has more locating pins, and it requires holes to be drilled in the dial. This is the traditional method to attach an applied indice. There are other methods now that involve transferring the indices to the dial already aligned, meaning using a transfer film and then applying them without any pins using an adhesive. It doesn't have to just be an applied indice. We could have applied numerals, and applied numerals would be some sort of metal that are shaped like the numeral 1 or 2, all the way through 12. These parts have to be either machined or stamped out and then added to the dial. Now, a more basic way to add the numbers to a dial is with a process called pad printing. This is a very old method that was actually developed for wristwatches. And in order to pad print, we first have to etch a plate. We etch the plate with the design, and then we fill the etching with an ink. We can then use a rubber stamp to pick up that ink. we move the dial underneath that rubber stamp, and we can deposit that ink onto the dial. And it's an extremely accurate, precise way to print onto an object that is not necessarily flat like a sheet of paper. In fact, because we have silicon, we can use very soft rubber stamps that are able to conform to the different shapes of watch dials. Now, after having the base color and whatever printed elements or applied elements added to that dial, we have to think about luminescent paint. Luminescent paint could be applied by hand, or it could be pad printed on. There's also the possibility today to use plastic parts that actually already glow. So a 3D numeral or a 3D index that can be applied to the dial, and the whole block of material already has luminescent materials suspended within it. But the more typical way would be to pad print another layer of luminescent paint on top of the indices or the numerals, or to fill in the applied indices or numerals with the paint. Traditionally, the subdial of a watch actually receives a special circular graining, and it's not necessarily a brushing pattern. It's actually a number of concentric rings, and there are special tools used to create this surface pattern. This is a separate step prior to the painting or the galvanizing of the dial. Even with this kind of rough, rippled surface finish, pad printing will allow us to add numerals and indices or any kind of design to that rippled surface. Now, some of the information that pretty regularly finds its way onto the dial of a watch will be things like the manufacturer's logo, possibly water resistance rating, if there is some sort of chronometer grade, or if a watch might be automatically winding, possibly manual winding. You may even see some watches that reference the number of joules. Some watches will actually mention the type of loom that is used in order to differentiate between radioactive loom and non-radioactive loom. Sometimes you'll also see a mention of where a watch was made, such as Swiss movement or made in USA. Whether a watch is a very simple watch or a very complex watch, the dial of the watch is what most attention will be paid to, because that's where the utility of the watch comes from, by being able to read the time. So it's not something to overlook. Even though it might seem like a very simple part of watchmaking, it's actually one of the most important parts of the overall design of a timepiece. Every little piece that is applied to a dial will need to be polished or brushed, finished, possibly plated, in whatever manner the design calls for. All of these different design elements are at the disposal of the designer, but because it is on display, it has to be very well thought out so that the proper finishes can be achieved in order to make that design work. And that, I think, is one of the most complex parts of watchmaking. When you think of a design, being able to actually realize that design the way that you want it is one of the toughest parts of watchmaking.